Our last storyteller for the evening, traveling in their VW bus through eastern Turkey in 1971 along the famed hippie trail, 6-year-old Caleb and his family get into some unexpected trouble. Please welcome Caleb Dardick with his story, Baksheesh or No Baksheesh.
Thank you, Megan. So, boy, it really is, where are you all out there? I was 5 years old in 1970 when my parents did the classic thing of that era. They turned on, tuned in, and dropped out. Being 5 years old, the next thing I knew, we had sold our very comfortable suburban house in St. Louis. We had boarded a plane and flown to Europe. We arrived in Germany and bought a brand new 1970 VW van. It was red. We named her Brunhilde. And we took off east for a 1-year trip that would probably get us to India. That was the plan. And that was the entire plan. I should tell you a bit about my family. My father, before the LSD and the dropping out, had been a very successful architect, city planner, and professor. He'd had childhood polio, so he used a wheelchair to get around. Very athletic, played wheelchair basketball. My mother, again, before all of these changes, was a bored housewife until she took LSD, and then everything changed dramatically. Turned my father on as well. I was the oldest of 3 kids. I was 5, as I mentioned. My little brother was 4. My sister was probably 1.5, still in diapers. And together, we set off onto this wild camping trip on the hippie trail. So when this story starts, we're about 9 months into our adventure, and we're somewhere in Turkey, east, maybe 300 miles east of Ankara, on our way to Iran. And I had really gotten into travel and always insisted on sitting, if you've ever been in a VW bus, between the 2 seats and sort of straddling and standing up between the passenger seat and the driver's seat and looking out the windshield to see what was coming. And so as the highway converges and it's hot, desolate, sweaty trip, we don't have AC in the van, and we come into this mid-sized town called Sivas, and traffic comes to a complete halt. And I look out the window, and it is just a wave of people. There's trucks, bicyclists, camels, people walking in all directions, herding sheep and goats. And my father's driving the van and probably going like barely 1 mile an hour. When all of a sudden, a man walks right into the car and falls down. My father steps on the brakes, or actually uses his hand control for the brakes, but hardly needed to. We weren't moving. And goes, "Oh my God, did you see that? That guy, he just walked right into the van. He did it on purpose." And the guy gets up and makes a huge show of rubbing his shoulders, and he's facing us through the windshield, and he's yelling and shouting, and he comes around to my father's side. My dad winds the window down. And the guy is shouting at my father and puts his hand out. Well, 9 months on the road, we can recognize a hustle. And my father goes, no, man, no baksheesh. The guy is inflamed. And he starts shouting, and because the street is so crowded, a crowd gathers around our VW, and the men in the crowd start pounding on the side of the van. Well, I'm absolutely terrified by this. My little brother, 4 years old, he throws himself against the window and screams back, at the angry horde that is there. And the van starts to move, and just at that moment we hear whistling and shouting, and we look up, and there are 3 police officers moving through the crowd, waving batons in uniform, sort of clearing everybody away, and they start shouting towards my father and basically directing us to move the car out of traffic off to the side of the road and to follow them. And my father does, complies, brings the vehicle over to the side, and he's, as always, so calm, rational, reassuring, and tells us everything is going to be fine. He reaches for his crutches and opens his door. And I should mention that when he doesn't use a wheelchair, he uses his crutches and full leg braces that attach at the hips and go straight down to his boots. And so we get out of the vehicle and we, follow through this sidewalk, thick crowd. And my mother is holding my little brother and sister. I'm tagging along behind, pulling her shirt tails. We follow the cops to this sort of squat concrete block police station. They lead us in this dark hallway and escort us into the windowless office of the chief of police. Now the chief, at least to my now 6-year-old big boy eyes, is terrifying, pockmarked, scarred, huge belly. He pulls himself out from behind his steel desk, lumbers up to my father, standing there, gets right in his face and goes, "Passport, passport." And my father indicates to my mother. She digs through her purse, pulls out our 5 weather-beaten passports, hands them to the chief. He gives them a cursory look, walks back to his desk, pulls the top drawer open and drops our passports in, comes back, again getting in my father's face and insisting, well, we see a pattern here, don't we? Insisting that we give him money. My father goes, no baksheesh, we did nothing wrong, and starts to explain what happened. Of course, he's speaking in English, the police chief is speaking in Turkish, no one is communicating, and so the chief gets frustrated and shouts out to his men, and 2 of his men disappear, and shortly thereafter they return, and they've carrying in this young man. He's in a nice suit, sort of Western attire, little tie, and it turns out that he's a clerk at the nearby hotel. And he speaks some English. And so he's like, "Yes, sir, may I help you?" And my father's so relieved and starts to tell him the story. The police chief immediately cuts him off and starts shouting and what he wants the interpreter to communicate to us. And the interpreter goes, "Mister, chief says you must pay fine or go to jail." Well, no baksheesh, we did nothing wrong. And the interpreter tries to explain that to the chief. Chief cuts him off, and again the interpreter repeats, "No, Mister must pay now or go to jail." And my father is again saying no, and at this point the chief throws up his hands, yells something to his men. They drag the poor clerk back out by his heels, out of the office, across the hall, and they throw him into a holding cell that we can see right outside the police chief's office. My mother, up until this point, unusually restrained, starts screaming, "You pigs, you fucking pigs!" And you can't do that, let him go. Now, if this behavior is supposed to intimidate my father, it backfires. He spins around on his crutches. He goes right after the cops in the hall, goes into the hall. He seizes the keys from one of the police officers. He brandishes his crutch to keep the other cops away. And it's like an episode out of The Lone Ranger. He opens the door, picks it open, and tells the man to run. And the young hotel clerk books it out of the station. My father turns around, and by this time now the chief is in the hall, the other cops are in the hall, and they're all coming at him, probably with the intent to throw him into the same jail cell. And just as they're about to put their hands on my father falls back, crashing to the ground, straight leg braces, hits the ground, clanking like the Tin Woodman, and now on his back is taking his crutches up in the air like some crazy mechanical turtle on its back, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Police brutality! Police brutality!" The cops, again, don't know what to make of this situation, step back, and in that moment, seizing upon their indecision, my father yells to my mother, "Get the passports." And she runs over to the desk, pulls the drawer open, grabs the passports, comes back, I got him. And Dad's picking himself off the floor, which is really quite a feat when you're in encased legs. And he's still shouting, police brutality, as we flee out of the police station. So we're going back, we're making a beeline back to the VW, and at this point, my mother starts screaming for help in English and in French. Those are the languages she knows, a little high school French. And so we get into the vehicle, slam the doors shut. We see that now the police have regrouped and they're coming after us. And just at that moment, we're rescued. A kindly, elegant gentleman with silver hair and a beautiful suit and tie taps on the window. Mom rolls it down just a bit, and they start speaking to each other in French. And she explains the situation, and he reassures her he can handle it, and he basically puts himself between our van and the cops and starts negotiating and arguing with the men over the cops about what needs to be done. One of the police officers leaves. He signals for us to wait and be patient. The police officer comes back with a piece of paper, hands it to the old gentleman. Old gentleman looks at it, nods, and slips it through the open gap, in the partially rolled down window. My mother looks at this, and it is a hand-scrawled document. She looks at him, and he indicates she should sign it. She looks at my father. My father sort of shrugs, why not? So she reaches into her purse, pulls out a pen, and she signs it. Fishes it back through the window. The old gentleman looks at it, nods, hands it to the police. Police sort of begrudgingly nod. Our confession, I guess, is acceptable. Man steps back, cops step back, signal for us to leave. Dad turns on the ignition, and slowly, so very painfully slowly, inch by inch, we merge back into the crowded thoroughfare. My brother and I rush to the back of the VW. We're looking out to see if we're being followed. Nobody's coming. I think all of us were worried. There wasn't a word in the car until we finally get out of town. We start to pick up speed. I look back, catch my father's eye in the rearview mirror. He smiles and says, "So boys, hungry for shish kebabs?"